Even without any clear justification, simply because of her skin color and age, the elderly black woman became the target of police officer Travis Colburn's unrelenting baton swing. He struck the car window with chilling indifference. Her blood spilled, yet his eyes remained calm, as if violence were an inherent privilege of the uniform. But what he didn't expect was that the woman he brutalized was the mother of the United States Attorney General. The moment he shattered her window was the same moment he shattered his career. Where you live. Does something like that happen often? The silver sedan rolled to a halt outside Chillville Town Hall under the sharp light of a late morning sun. Its faded paint, once a brighter tone of metal, had dulled with age, giving the car the look of something out of step with the world around it. It didn't purr, didn't growl, just sighed into stillness like it had arrived not at a destination but at a decision. Inside, the woman behind the wheel didn't move. Her hands rested on the steering wheel with quiet poise, and her eyes, though open, were not scanning the area. They seemed instead to be looking through time. She sat as if she had been there 100 times before, and had long since grown tired of explaining her presence. From a distance, Officer Travis Colburn watched, not liking any of it. He had seen her pull up slowly from the far end of the block, a silver shape easing between the lines, coasting with too much grace for a morning so full of rules. Something in her posture immediately put him on alert. She hadn't looked around like most people do when they park in front of a government building. No checking for signs, no glancing in the mirrors, no eye contact. That, to him, was a tell. No one avoided eye contact unless they had something to hide. And if there was one thing Travis trusted more than procedure, it was instinct. His job wasn't to wait for wrongdoing. It was to recognize the shadow of it. He shifted the cruiser into gear and rolled across the lot toward her. No lights, no siren. That wasn't necessary, not when a conversation would suffice. Or better yet, a warning. As he approached, he kept his angle tight, blocking the sedan's path of exit. He parked, adjusted his sunglasses, and stepped out, his boots striking the pavement with the kind of authority that years in uniform had made second nature. He moved slowly, deliberately, allowing each step to say what he hadn't yet voiced. I see you. I'm in charge. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Standing beside the driver's window, he leaned in slightly and tapped twice against the glass. There was no reaction. The woman didn't startle, didn't glance his way, didn't roll the window down. Her head was tilted slightly forward, as if listening for something beyond human ears. Her stillness wasn't stubborn, it was tranquil, and that made him angrier than defiance would have. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound of his knuckles cracking against glass, cutting sharply through the morning air. "Ma'am," he said, projecting his voice with that calculated tone of command, "I need you to roll the window down." At last, she turned her head, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look confused or startled. If anything, she looked tired. Her hand moved slowly toward the controls, and the window edged down halfway with a faint mechanical hum. That was it. He waited. "All the way," he said, sharper this time. The woman nodded faintly, her hand trembling as she tried to press the button again, but the window stayed where it was. Either she didn't hear him properly, or she wasn't moving fast enough to satisfy his sense of order. He tried again. "Ma'am, I need to ask why you've stopped in front of a federal building." She moved her lips, but her voice came out low, dry, barely more than breath. He leaned closer, but still couldn't catch it. "I can't hear you," he said, impatient now. "Do you have business here?" The woman raised one hand and gently tapped her ear, a small gesture indicating hearing trouble. Her other hand rested limply in her lap, unmoving. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who'd spent her life not being heard. Travis glanced down at the license plate. Federal tags. Too clean, too official. Didn't match the make of the car. That was enough to light the suspicion in his gut like kerosene on flame. "Where'd you get those plates?" he asked, now standing straighter. "Are they yours?" No answer. Just the same calm stare. The same silence. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip, resting now on the edge of his holster. "You're parked in front of a government building with federal plates that don't match the vehicle profile, and you're not answering questions," he said, voice rising. "That gives me reason to escalate." She opened her mouth again, but only managed a single word. waiting. Whether she meant she was waiting for someone or just waiting in general wasn't clear, and Travis wasn't in the mood for ambiguity. "Waiting, huh?" he said, eyebrows raised, sarcasm thick in his throat. "And what exactly are you waiting for outside a municipal building in an unmarked federal vehicle?" Still no clear answer, no credentials offered, no ID, just that quiet. Then he said it, the sentence that would hang in the air like smoke. "People like you don't stop near buildings like this." It wasn't loud, it wasn't screamed, but it hit like a brick through glass. The phrase was deliberate, curved around history, weaponized by tone. People like you. Not you, but the kind of person you represent. Not a threat, not a criminal, just someone who didn't belong. The woman blinked once, then met his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were steady, not hard, not pleading, just deeply, profoundly present. The kind of eyes that had seen a century pass. She didn't reply. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him in a way that made the whole moment suddenly feel much smaller than it had a second ago. But Travis didn't notice, or wouldn't let himself. He stepped back and gestured broadly toward the building. "You think I don't have the right to stop you? You think because you're old and quiet and sit there like a statue that this doesn't look suspicious?" His tone had shifted now from accusation to justification, from question to declaration. A few people nearby began to pay attention. A mother pushing a stroller paused at the sidewalk. A man with a coffee stood frozen near a trash can. The city buzz had dimmed, just slightly, but noticeably. Still, no one intervened. Travis wasn't done. "This is official government property. You're driving a vehicle with unverified federal plates, and you're refusing to give identification. That's enough for me to consider this a security risk." He reached for his belt again, not yet drawing his weapon, but making it known he was ready. "Ma'am, I'm advising you one last time. Roll your window down all the way, produce ID, or I'm escalating this stop." The woman didn't speak. She looked down once more, resting her hand in her lap, her body still. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was resolve. It was the kind of silence that absorbs violence instead of resisting it, and that, more than anything, enraged him. She didn't apologize, she didn't protest, she just existed. And in that moment, for Travis Colburn, that was more threatening than any weapon. The final straw wasn't a word or a gesture or a movement. It was the sheer audacity of her calm. He stepped back again, lips pressed tight, fury simmering under skin. His voice dropped an octave, cold as iron. "You don't get to act like this isn't suspicious. Not today. Not with how things are." He leaned in one last time and hissed, "You don't belong here. And you never did." She didn't belong here. That was the last thing he said. And then, for a moment, the air went still. Heavy, suffocating stillness. Before violence punched through it like thunder cracking porcelain, Travis moved before thought could catch up to him. There was no pause, no command, no lawful preamble. His hand dropped from the grip of his holster and yanked the steel baton from his belt with a fluid, practiced flick. It was as if his body had decided before his brain had finished its tantrum. With a quick step back and a brutal swing forward, the first blow landed against the windshield with a sickening, dull thunk. Not the cinematic shatter he expected, but something denser, more resistant, tempered glass. His jaw tightened. The woman inside didn't scream. She didn't flinch. The window trembled beneath the impact, fractured like ice under a heavy boot, but it did not break. He saw the cracks spider across the glass like veins under pressure, radiating from the point of contact, and that only enraged him more. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Resistance was supposed to be obvious, loud, messy, something that made it easier to justify what came next. But she gave him nothing. No protest, no sound, just those dark, ancient eyes fixed somewhere beyond him, unwavering. He grunted and raised the baton again, this time with less restraint. The second strike came down like judgment. Teeth clenched, forearms stiff with fury. The glass broke. It didn't explode, not all at once, but fragmented with violent elegance. Thousands of crystalline shards dislodged and clattered in a slow cascade, raining inward with a sound that didn't echo but sank. A sharp edge sliced the woman's cheek as the windshield finally gave. Just a nick, almost nothing, but it bled. A single line of red bloomed against the dark skin of her face, small at first, then widening in slow motion as it traced downward toward her jaw. The blood looked black in the shadow of the fractured glass, then vivid as it caught the sunlight pouring through the jagged breach. She didn't cry out. She didn't recoil. She lifted one hand, a slow, deliberate motion, and touched the wound with the tips of her fingers. It was not a gesture of fear, but recognition, as if pain had finally arrived to confirm what she already knew. The violence wasn't coming, it was here, and it had always been waiting. Her hand shook faintly as it rose, and in that gesture the light found something else, something subtle but unmistakable. A ring, thick, gold, worn down by time, set with an etched symbol that caught and refracted the sun like a secret unwilling to be hidden. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't ostentatious, but it was there, and it gleamed like a warning. Travis saw it but didn't register what it meant. He wasn't looking for meaning. He was still trapped inside his rage. And that ring, rather than slow him, added fuel to the fire. His face curled into a sneer. "What the hell is that?" he snapped, but she didn't answer. She kept her hand raised, fingers stained with her blood, as if the gesture itself were enough. He didn't press for clarification. He didn't ask. Instead, he stepped back, spat into the dust, and glanced once, just once, at the small camera pinned to his chest. Then he pressed the side button and shut it off. He told himself it was a glitch. The battery was low, that maybe he'd forgotten to activate it earlier. But in truth, he didn't want a record of what was coming. The policy manual said body cams were mandatory for all public interactions. But policy was paper, and right now, Travis Colburn was a man made of fire and flint, and he didn't care what was written on paper. Behind him, the street began to stir. A door opened across the plaza. Someone's voice floated into the air and hung there like smoke, but he tuned it out. He was no longer aware of anything but the pounding rhythm of his pulse. He pointed the baton, now flecked with bits of glass and sunlight, directly at the shattered window. "I don't need a damn warrant when I suspect terrorism," he shouted, voice cutting through the square like a blade, "and I sure as hell don't need permission to stop someone with federal tags sitting like a goddamn statue in front of a government building." The words echoed. They landed. He wanted them to. He said it loud enough for bystanders to hear, because part of him needed an audience. Not for validation, for domination. It was never about the car, never about the tags. It was about control. And the fact that she hadn't handed it over, but inside the car she did not answer. Her breathing had slowed to something almost meditative, and her blood, not gushing, just present, now drew a quiet trail down the curve of her face. It traced the lines of age, slid past the shadow of her cheekbone, and stopped at the corner of her chin. Her mouth didn't move. Her eyes didn't flinch. She was made of something he could not name, and that scared him more than any threat. The fragments of the windshield glittered on the dashboard like shattered diamonds, some still clinging to the frame, others resting in her lap. Her blouse, pale lavender, caught the red in strange contrast, soft fabric kissed by cruelty. The ring on her finger flashed again in the shifting light, a flicker, a pulse, as if it were breathing. He noticed it again now, not the symbol itself, but the way it caught and deflected everything. His gaze the sun, the weight of what he'd done. It gleamed like a challenge, like a mark. But still she said nothing, not one word, not one scream. The silence pressed back at him harder than any voice could have, and the blood kept trickling, patient, unashamed, unapologetic. He clenched the baton tighter, wrist aching, lungs tight. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to react, to cry, to curse, to validate the aggression he had already committed, but she only sat there, ringed in broken glass, bleeding, dignified, unbroken. She didn't resist, she endured, and that was worse. The street was no longer empty. People were gathering, drawn by the shouts, the sound of glass breaking, the unmistakable tone of something gone too far. But Travis, caught in the red fog of pride and panic, didn't see them, or wouldn't let himself. He'd already crossed the line, and now the only direction left was forward. The glass was still settling, those glittering shards trembling on the dashboard like frozen raindrops, when the air around them cracked open with voices not their own. What began as a murmur turned into tension-laced breath, the subtle hum of awareness shifting to a sound no badge could silence. Witness. One boy, no older than 16, lanky, limbs loose with the weightlessness of youth, but eyes sharpened by the world around him, had already pulled his phone from his hoodie pocket. The screen lit up in his hand, pointed without hesitation toward the scene, and in the lens of his camera he captured not just the blood, but the brutal calm behind it. His thumb tapped once, record. Then, live, the red circle pulsed. Travis didn't notice him at first, too focused on his breath, too consumed by the cold electricity still buzzing in his muscles after the glass gave way. But the murmurs grew. A ripple of reaction began folding across the sidewalk, small clusters of people shifting, stopping, frowning, and then the shouting started, not from the woman in the car, not from Travis, but from a man, gray-haled, hard-lined, wearing a veteran's cap tilted forward over a face carved in disbelief. He stood near the street lamp, fists balled, voice rising like gravel underfoot. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, throat raw, the kind of roar that cracks across a generation's silence. Travis turned his head sharply. The sound snapped his attention away from the woman, and he saw the old man's stance. Defiant, protective, ready. "Back off!" Travis barked, stepping forward without hesitation. The baton was still in his hand. It twitched with memory. "This is an active stop," he added, the words mechanical, rote, like lines spat from a manual that had never accounted for accountability. "Keep moving, sir. I served so people like her could be safe," the man shouted again, louder this time. "And you just—" He didn't get to finish. Travis shoved him. Hard. The veteran's knees gave before his voice did, and he hit the pavement in a half-turn, the sound of his body catching air followed by the sharp thud of contact. Someone gasped. Another stepped back. The boy with the phone kept filming, and the world once again forgot how to blink. A woman, not far from the edge of the lot, stepped forward. White, mid-30s, slacks and blazer, business badge swinging from her neck. Her phone was already raised, already aimed. She didn't speak, just documented. One movement, one purpose. She didn't flinch when Travis turned to her next, eyes narrowed into slits that boiled with the kind of authority no oath should protect. "You can't record here," he snapped. "Yes, I can," she replied, calm, razor-sharp. "This is a public space." Travis stepped toward her. She didn't move. He blocked her view with his body, standing inches away, not touching, but looming. "You're interfering with law enforcement," he hissed. "Turn it off, or I'll take the phone." Her lips tightened. She didn't argue. She didn't budge. But her screen stayed lit, and the little red light in the corner didn't blink. Around them the air got heavier. Time stretched thin. And inside the car, the woman bled. The trail down her cheek had slowed to a stillness, blood drying against her skin in dark crimson arcs, but her posture hadn't shifted. Her hands remained where they were, her head bowed slightly, not in surrender, but stillness. She had not spoken since it began, not cried out, not asked for mercy. Her silence was thunder, steady and deliberate, louder than every scream around her. She didn't need to raise her voice. The street would do it for her. Travis turned back, lips curled. He felt it slipping, felt the situation unraveling in slow motion, fiber by fiber, thread by thread. He reached for his radio. The clip snapped free from his shoulder with a practiced motion. "Dispatch, this is Officer Colburn at Town Hall requesting immediate backup. Possible resistance. Suspect may have concealed weapon. Crowd forming. Situation escalating." He said it smoothly, efficiently, like he'd rehearsed it, the kind of call that changed a woman in a sedan into a coded threat. He hadn't seen a weapon. He didn't need to. The claim alone would bend the response. Because the system didn't run on truth, it ran on narrative. And Travis had always known how to write one fast. The people around him shifted. Some pulled out their phones. Some stepped closer. Others stayed frozen, unsure whether to speak or flee. But one voice, fragile and low, finally rose, barely more than a whisper, but heavy enough to silence everything around it. "My grandson," the woman said, her voice dry and even, as if pulled from deep within. "He shouldn't see this." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a fact, simple and final. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't rise, but in it lived the sorrow of centuries and the fury of knowing it never ends. And somehow, that single sentence cracked open the moment in a way no scream could. Travis heard it, and something inside him recoiled, not in guilt, but in irritation. He had planned to shout, for struggle, for the kind of resistance that justified force, but not this goddamn dignity, not this refusal to break, and that's what made her dangerous, not her body, not her silence, but her power to remain whole in the face of humiliation. The teen with the phone zoomed in now. He captured her profile, the dried blood on her cheek, the broken glass glinting like warning stars. He didn't speak. His stream didn't need commentary. His silence was a choice. He had grown up in this kind of America. He knew what it meant to bear witness. Behind him, more people arrived, some by curiosity, others by instinct. A mother pulled her child behind her. A man on a bicycle slowed and stayed. A janitor stepped out from the municipal building with his cart and stopped mid-step, mop handle angled like a forgotten spear. All of them are watching. None of them is moving. The tension was no longer a wave. It was a wall. Travis tried again. "She's non-compliant. For all I know, she could have something in the vehicle. You people need to back up. This is about safety." But his words no longer rang with certainty. They echoed instead with the desperation of someone trying to convince himself that this was still under control. The woman didn't lift her head. She didn't reply, but she didn't have to. Her presence said it all. She was a monument to restraint, wrapped in lavender cloth and dignity, seated in a broken car beneath a broken man. The blood on her face dried like paint. Her silence stained the air. Her stillness screamed. And around her the street began to tilt, not into chaos, but into memory, a place the nation had visited before and never stayed long enough to fix. The silence around her thickened, pressing in like storm air before lightning, but she remained unmoved, the weight of the world bearing down on her, and still she did not break. The blood had dried to a slow rust against her cheek, a quiet defiance in crimson, the line of it now soaking gradually into the collar of her lavender blouse, a color too soft for this kind of day, too graceful to belong in a war zone like this parking lot. But it stayed. It clung to her like memory, like a hymn sung under breath. And Travis Colburn, fists tight and pulse high, stepped into that grace with all the violence of someone who had mistaken patience for weakness and silence for surrender. He yanked the door open with a single motion, hinges groaning in protest, and reached in with the certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. His grip wrapped around her arm. Not gentle, not procedural. It was the grip of authority with something to prove. He pulled hard, dragging her body forward in one raw motion, ignoring the way her knees struggled to keep pace, ignoring the blood on her face, the brittle age of her bones, the weight of time wrapped in her skin. She didn't cry out. She didn't plead. She rose slowly, like a monument waking from stone, and let him drag her. Her blouse caught the sunlight as she moved, the pale purple of it now kissed with red, the color deepening along the collar, blooming like ink on silk. The fabric clung to her shoulder blades as if trying to hold her back, but Travis kept pulling. Faster now, no hesitation. When they reached the hood of the cruiser, he slammed her forward, both hands on her shoulders, forcing her down. Her palms splayed against the hot metal, her cheek pressed to the surface. The blood from her face smeared a fresh mark across the glossy black of the hood, a single red smear on a mirror made for judgment. "I'll show you what resisting looks like," Travis growled, his voice curling out like smoke from a dying engine. "You think you're going to ignore me? You think I'm just going to let you sit there and stare like you're above the law?" He leaned down close to her ear, his words acidic. scorching the air between them. "This is what happens when you test the system, lady." She didn't reply. Her fingers flexed once against the metal, not in protest, just to feel something steady beneath them. She blinked slowly, one eye half shielded by the strands of gray hair now falling over her face. Her breathing didn't quicken. Her pulse didn't race. She had been here before, not in body, in history, in legacy. And the weight of that history held her steady now, as his rage scraped against her dignity and failed to leave a crack. A female officer on the perimeter, tall, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, stepped forward, unsure, mouth already parting to speak. "Travis," she began, a warning in her tone, not defiance, yet just alarm. He spun, eyes blazing, and waved a hand with a force that cut the sentence off mid-air. "Back the hell off, Jenna. I've GT this." But she tried again. "I said, back off," he snapped, louder now, his voice echoing across the lot, snapping birds from the roof, silencing breath. Jenna froze. She looked at the woman splayed across the hood, saw the blood, the posture, the collar, drenched in streaked red-purple, and then she looked back at Travis, saw the baton still in his hand, saw the sweat on his temple, saw the unhinged gleam in his eye. She stepped back, slowly, not in agreement, in fear, not of the woman, of him. The teenager still filming didn't move. His phone was steady now, clenched tighter than before, the stream still live, the numbers rising. He didn't speak, but his hands began to shake, just barely. And then someone in the crowd shouted. It was an older voice, a man's cracked with disbelief and fury. "I've seen her," he bellowed. "I've seen her on the wall of honor, downtown. You're hurting someone. Who's been there?" The words cut through the heat like a sudden winter breeze. The ripple in the crowd turned to a wave. More phones were lifted. More faces turned. The murmurs rose like pressure behind a dam. But Travis didn't look up. He pressed harder on her back, fingers digging in. "I don't give a damn where she's been," he snarled. "Right now, she's obstructing, refusing orders, and potentially armed. I don't care what legend she thinks she is. Out here, she's just another problem." The phrase hit the air with rot, not just the words, but the tone. Indifferent, smug, poisoned by power. It wasn't about the law. It never had been. The woman's body shifted under his grip, not to escape, not to fight, but simply to breathe. She exhaled, long and deep, as if releasing generations of grief in a single breath. The sunlight shifted. It caught the blood on her blouse and turned it to flame. The purple of her collar, soaked now in deeper red, glowed with a strange majesty. The badge on Travis's chest gleamed too, but it didn't look noble. It looked heavy, hollow, like a counterfeit version of something once real. She didn't speak, she didn't look at him, but in the stillness of her breath, the set of her spine, the slight turn of her head, there was defiance, elegant and old as dust. She wasn't resisting, she was witnessing, and that difference was everything. And still, Travis didn't see it. Couldn't, wouldn't. He was too deep into the lie of it now, too entangled in the belief that force made him right. He hadn't noticed that the woman wasn't breaking. He hadn't noticed that the crowd was growing, that the voices were multiplying, that his silence on the body cam would become his confession. All he saw was a figure on a hood that refused to cower, and that, to him, was the ultimate threat. He stood back finally, panting slightly, and looked around, not to take stock, but to calculate. Too many people, too many phones, too many eyes that didn't believe his version of the story anymore. And at the center of it all, her, bleeding, upright, still, her hands still pressed to the hood, her fingers now curled slightly as if preparing to rise, not run. She turned her head, just enough to face the crowd, and the sunlight hit her cheek again, lighting up the blood like a ribbon of truth. No words, no sermon, just a glance, and in that glance everything began to shift. The air had begun to thicken, taut with unspoken tension when the sky finally gave way. The first drop hit the back of her hand like a warning. Cold, clean, indifferent. Then another fell, this time catching the curve of her cheek, sliding silently through the streak of dried blood as if to wash it away. The sky, gray and swollen with a storm it could no longer contain, released its weight. Rain came not in a torrent, not yet, but in deliberate rhythm, each drop a punctuation mark, falling on a sentence the country was still trying to rewrite. It darkened everything it touched. The pavement turned to slate, the black hood of the cruiser dulled to charcoal, and the lavender fabric clinging to her shoulder blades deepened to bruised plum. The blood that had dried now loosened under the drizzle, mixing with water, becoming something thinner, something more haunting. A crimson stream curled down the slope of the car's hood, twisting, blooming across the metal, then dripping in silence to the street below. Travis barely noticed the rain. He was too focused on control, still locked in the echo chamber of his adrenaline. His grip returned to her wrist, tighter now, his knuckles white with authority that had begun to taste like fear. He jerked her upright. Not gently, not lawfully, just decisively. The weight of her body yielded with a slow grace that mocked his urgency. Her spine straightened as he pulled, but her feet moved with deliberate slowness, a drag that refused to match the force behind it. It wasn't resistance. It was something older, deeper, like a stone being pulled by a rope. She did not speak. Her blouse, soaked now, clung to her frame, revealing every ripple of age, of dignity hard-earned and unmoved. Her blood, once a line, now became a blur, seeping into the fabric, becoming part of the color. The rain streaked down her neck, over her collarbone, joining the remnants of violence and quiet revolt. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't offer him a name. She let the moment do the speaking, the water, the blood, the silence. The car door still hung open from before, and as the wind began to rise, a sudden gust cut through the interior. Papers inside shifted like nervous thoughts, and then a folder near the passenger seat burst open. Dozens of sheets fanned outward, some catching air, some sliding to the floor mat, and one, just one, took flight. It rose, light and determined, dancing erratically before it landed just outside the vehicle. A gust flipped it once, twice. Then it stopped, face up, glistening beneath the growing rain. It wasn't a sheet of paper, it was a card, laminated, faded, official. A diplomatic ID? No one noticed it at first. It lay in the open like a relic, its seal half hidden under a film of water, the text too smeared to read from a distance. But it was there, real, intact, radiating history, and still, no one bent to pick it up. No one knew what they were looking at, and that was the tragedy of it. Proof, power, protection, all lying useless in the open, while hands bled behind steel cuffs. Travis didn't see it. He was too focused on forcing her toward the cruiser, dragging her step by step. "Let's go," he muttered, voice sharp, bitter, chewing the consonants like gravel. "You've made your point. Now we're done." But they weren't. Not by a mile, because nothing about this was over, and the rain knew it. It fell harder now, more certain, slicing diagonals across the scene, soaking his shoulders, matting his hair, turning his confidence into something damp and uncomfortable. His badge shone briefly under a flicker of lightning, but even that gleam looked borrowed. Across the street, the teenager was still filming. He had not said a word since pressing record, but the screen in his hand told the story. A woman, dragged, bleeding, rain-washed, dignity wrapped in purple and silence. The sound of cuffs locking into place was barely audible over the growing patter of rain, but the image, the posture, the walk, the bloodline streaking down her cheek that was loud enough. She did not struggle as she was guided, no, forced toward the back seat of the cruiser. Her legs moved with a quiet rhythm, knees aching, steps measured. Every inch of her motion felt like a rebuke, like a memory being carved into the pavement. The cuffs at her wrists bit slightly under the strain, but she did not complain. She bowed her head slightly as she stepped in, more out of balance than surrender, and disappeared into the darkness of the vehicle's interior. The door shut behind her with a hollow thud. For a second, everything paused, even the crowd, even the sky, and then it moved again. From inside the glass entrance of the town hall, a man had watched the entire scene. Mid-40s, suit wrinkled, tie loosened, badge clipped to his belt but forgotten. A city official, low-ranking but not blind. His face was pale. His mouth had not closed since the baton struck glass. And now, as the rain began to drip from the eaves above him, he moved, fast. He turned from the window and ran back into the building, shoes squeaking against tile, hand already fumbling for a phone. No one saw who he dialed. No one heard what he said. But the call began before the cruiser even left the curb. Outside, the air buzzed. The crowd had grown thicker now, heads turning toward one another, whispers bleeding into anger. Someone cursed, someone wept, and the teen, still live-streaming, tapped the caption bar with one trembling thumb. He typed slowly, deliberately, each letter weighted with disbelief. Then he hit send. She's bleeding, and they still don't stop. The words appeared at the bottom of the screen, white text over a rain-smeared image, just as the cruiser began to pull away. The tires hissed against the wet pavement, and inside, in the shadows, she sat alone, cuffed, silent, soaked. But her presence was not diminished. If anything, it filled the back seat like a prophecy, quiet but unstoppable. No one knew, not yet, what the card on the pavement meant. No one bent to pick it up. The rain kept falling on it like an apology. But it would remain there for now, unnoticed, unclaimed, soaking in the water and the blood, waiting to be seen. The cruiser turned left at the signal, its red taillights smeared by the curtain of rain. In the back seat, the woman sat motionless, her silhouette barely visible through the water-beaded window, her figure absorbed by shadow, but not diminished. She did not shift. She did not blink. The cuffs bit into her wrists beneath soaked fabric, and the faint echo of the crowd's disbelief still clung to the edges of her silence. Her blood remained part of her blouse now, no longer distinguishable from the purple, like an oath pressed into cotton. She said nothing. The street said everything for her. Inside the Chillville Municipal Building, the hallway had gone silent again. The city clerk stood alone, drenched not from rain but from something colder, realization. His hand gripped the phone so tightly that it creaked against his palm. He stared at it for one beat, two, then turned and ducked into a side office with a flick of his wrist, shutting the door behind him without a word. No one followed. No one asked. He didn't sit. He didn't breathe steadily. He just unlocked the screen, swiped through contacts, and tapped the one entry that wasn't labeled by name. Just a single letter, D. The line connected after only one ring. He didn't wait for pleasantries. His voice came low, brittle, still shaken from the sight of blood smearing the hood of a government cruiser. "She's in custody," he said, throat tight. "Cuffed. They slammed her into the car. They don't know who she is. They don't know what they just did." A beat of silence followed. The voice on the other end was unhurried, calm, deep, not curious, not alarmed, just still. "I'll come," it said. That was all. No questions, no hesitation, just a vow spoken like gravity. The line went dead. Across the state line, 80 miles away, the clouds pressed lower over a military airfield nestled in pine country, where the wind howled against locked hangars and runways painted in quiet. From a hangar tucked into the edge of the tarmac, a mat-thick SUV rolled forward without headlights. No license plate, no markings. The vehicle moved as if guided by something more precise than maps. It slid through the open gate without challenge, tires humming like a bass line. No one saluted, no one signaled. Inside, the driver's hand stayed steady at 10 and 2, gloved in black, motionless except for the rotation of the wheel. No music, no chatter, just the hum of power barely restrained. The windshield caught the rhythm of the rain in staccato bursts, but the wipers didn't swipe. They didn't need to. The road ahead wasn't blurred, the purpose was clear. Back in Chillville, Travis sat in the passenger seat of the second cruiser, chewing the inside of his cheek, while the other officer at the wheel asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. His fingers tapped against the thigh of his pants in sharp, angry beats. Not from nerves, but from calculation. He knew the footage would go viral. He knew the words shouted from the crowd had already metastasized into hashtag, but he still told himself it would pass. He still thought his badge was armor. He didn't know there were wheels already in motion, faster and older than him. He didn't hear the phone call. He didn't see the SUV leave the airstrip. He didn't feel the air shift behind him. The SUV moved faster now, tires gripping soaked asphalt, turning off the main highway and onto a service road used only by government transport and the rare vehicle that did not need to be seen. The interior was silent. No dispatch, no dashboard beeps, only the occasional voice from a secure satellite channel. Coded, brief, and unimportant. The person inside didn't respond. Their presence wasn't for communication. It was for the conclusion. No one knew the route. No one monitored its trajectory. The vehicle cut across time and terrain like it had a right to rewrite distance. Trees blurred past in streaks of shadow. Town signs vanished behind tinted windows. The lights of Chillville glowed faintly on the horizon, flickering through mist, unprepared. In the Chillville precinct, the storm had finally turned personal. Rain tapped against the windows of the front lobby, while a cluster of phones rang without answer. Officers moved more slowly now, unsure of their footing, aware in a new way that something had shifted. A few huddled around monitors showing live stream footage from earlier, eyes narrowed, faces pinched. One asked if Travis had turned his body cam on. No one answered. In a dim corner of the building, a captain reached for his phone, pausing just long enough to pull the blinds shut first. The silence in the station wasn't silence. It was compression. The black SUV crossed into town limits 5 minutes later. It did not stop at red lights. It did not brake at turns. The street cameras did not ping their presence, and the precinct's system wouldn't log the time of arrival. This wasn't a procedure, it was the consequence. It moved like judgment born in silence, and at its wheel sat someone no one had been trained to prepare for. Inside the cruiser where she sat, Lorraine Mitchell had not moved. Her eyes were closed, not in sleep but in suspension, a moment stolen between violation and verdict. Her breathing remained even. Her back was upright despite the rough ride. Her wrists, marked now by the steel cuffs, rested against her lap with poise not even pain could dim. The officer driving hadn't spoken since they left the square. He wouldn't look at her in the mirror, and she didn't need him to. Somewhere across town, the SUV turned down a narrow access road behind the courthouse. It didn't idle, it didn't park. It simply slowed as the figure inside adjusted their coat and opened the door before the wheels had stopped turning. Black boots stepped out into the rain. No umbrella, no hesitation. The rain hit the coat in steady percussion. The wind didn't touch the figure. They walked toward the precinct, not like a person arriving, but like a shadow reclaiming a space that had forgotten it. No one in the lobby saw the door open. No one heard the boots echo against the tile. But the receptionist, a civilian assistant, looked up just in time to see a figure pass the metal detector without pause, without alert. The badge that flashed at her was silver and clean, trimmed in a type of authority she didn't recognize. Her mouth opened. No sound came. The figure didn't stop walking. In the holding wing, Travis was just beginning to speak to an internal affairs liaison who had been called prematurely, or so they thought. His voice was low but tight, curling around excuses. He was explaining posture, resistance, tactics. The woman, he said, had refused to comply. He didn't mention the glass, the blood, the silence. He was halfway through a sentence when the door to the corridor opened behind him, and a gust of cold air silenced the room. Someone walked in. No introduction, no name, just the press of boots against linoleum and the weight of presence that did not require permission. And Travis turned, slowly, as if his body had already understood what his mind refused to believe. He turned slowly, as if dragged by the weight of inevitability, just as the station's internal silence was swallowed by a noise far more invasive. Not footsteps, not voices, not the impact of a door slamming, but the digital roar of a world beginning to pay attention. It did not knock. It did not wait to be let in. It bled through screens, surged across timelines, and struck the city not with sound, but with exposure. And just like that, Chillville stopped being a town. It became a headline. Purple Lady, that was the name that split the algorithm open like a wound. It started as a whisper, a single tweet under a grainy still frame of a woman in lavender being forced into a black and white cruiser, cuffs tight, rain streaking across her brow like war paint. Within minutes, it was everywhere. The hashtag climbed like a storm surge, first the region, then the state, then the national feed. In under 2 hours, it pierced the global top 10. No context, no biography, just the image. Soaked, bloody, restrained, and the color purple, blazing across feeds like royalty in distress. The clip itself hit 400,000 shares by noon, a shaky 32-second video, recorded by a boy whose name no one knew yet, showing the moment she was pulled from the car, forced against metal, and dragged through water thick with her blood. There was no commentary, no screaming voice behind the camera, only rain, gasps, the sharp click of cuffs, and a silence at the center of it that thundered louder than anything else. No spin, no editing, just impact. And impact, in this era, didn't need permission to spread. Cable networks hesitated. Local affiliates scrambled. Editors bickered over how to frame it. But the internet had already chosen its frame. She was not just a woman anymore. She was a symbol, an omen, a mistake carved into pixels. By mid-afternoon, a freelance journalist with sharp eyes and a dangerous memory unearthed a photograph buried in a wire service archive. The image was nearly a decade old, low resolution, color faded, but it was clear enough. A woman in a lavender scarf, standing 3 feet behind the President of the United States at a civil liberties summit. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't posing, she was observing. Her hands folded, her presence quiet but weighted. In the image, she wore the same ring, the one that had glinted through the shattered windshield. No one had noticed it before. Now, everyone did. Speculation metastasized. Who was she? Was she a retired official, a diplomat, a judge? The threads unraveled fast. A government ID was found, zoomed in, distorted, and left on the curb beside the broken glass in frame 29 of the original clip. The emblem was smeared, but the shape was distinct enough for conspiracy forums to catch it. It wasn't just federal. It was diplomatic. And suddenly, this wasn't just police brutality. This was a scandal. A reporter for a mid-tier newspaper contacted the NAACP's Eastern Legal Director, hoping for a statement. She was told, "No comment at this time." The words came clipped, controlled, too careful. And that silence screamed even louder. Every hour brought new teeth. A popular podcast replayed the clip on loop, dissecting the posture of the officer, the hesitation in the crowd, and the way the cuffs closed without struggle. "There's a difference," the host said, voice like velvet dipped in gasoline, "between arresting someone and erasing someone. That woman didn't just get detained. She disappeared in public, and they still thought they'd get away with it." Then came the ex-post, anonymous, no handle, no source, just white text on black. "They smashed the wrong car. They touched someone you're not supposed to touch." The post was reposted 60,000 times in 3 hours. No one knew who wrote it. Everyone believed it. Inside the Chillville precinct, the temperature shifted, not physically, but atmospherically. It moved like gas, odorless, invisible, suffocating. Officers who had once spoken in clipped jokes now whispered in corners. Desktops lit up with side-by-side comparisons of the viral clip and the summit photo. No one said the name. No one dared. Travis, still stewing in the briefing room, hadn't checked his phone. No one had brought him a charger. The world beyond the station hadn't reached him yet. He still believed he could steer the narrative. He didn't know the narrative had left him behind hours ago. Across the country, a senator retweeted the video with 3 words, "We saw it all." A civil rights organization posted the photo from the summit alongside a cropped shot from the arrest, the caption reading, "10 years apart. Same woman, different America." A morning show debated whether it was lawful to record police interactions. A late-night comedian said, "Apparently purple is the new threat color." The audience didn't laugh. The room had shifted. No one was ready to joke. Not yet. There was no press conference, no official name release. No charges filed, but the silence of law enforcement only fed the machine. Every second of quiet was filled by someone louder. A viral thread claimed she once ran a federal investigation into domestic surveillance. Another claimed she had an immunity status. A third posted an old obituary for a decorated general, listing her as next of kin. The accuracy didn't matter. The hunger did. At 5:27 p.m., a government server somewhere in D.C. flagged 3 internal queries on a redacted personnel file. All 3 were denied. The same server logged 6 more attempts in the next hour. No access granted. But the alerts were noted, privately, at a level not reflected in the press. Outside the Chillville courthouse, a group of university students chalked "Purple Lady" onto the steps in lavender dust. When the rain returned, it smeared the letters across stone, turning them into watercolor wounds. Inside, Lorraine Mitchell remained silent. She hadn't said another word since being placed in the cruiser. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't requested medical attention. She sat with the patience of someone who understood that noise wasn't always power, and that sometimes silence was the blade. Every camera, every hashtag, every click of outrage was a storm she did not summon, but one she had endured long before this moment. She didn't need to explain herself. The world was doing it for her now, one repost at a time. The station was still humming with denial when the real silence arrived. Not the kind born of fear or guilt or exhaustion, but the kind that descends when something far greater than consequence steps into the room. Outside, the world was unraveling in data, tags trending, voices rising, feeds boiling with righteous noise. But none of that mattered here. The black SUV rolled into Chillville like a secret already known, its matte body absorbing the last light of the storm-drenched afternoon, engine whispering beneath the shroud of government anonymity. No plates, no logos, no insignia. It moved like it didn't need permission, like it was never meant to be seen, only felt. When the passenger door opened, the man who stepped out brought with him no sound, no shadow, only pressure. He moved like law made flesh, not the kind found in handbooks or shouted through megaphones, but the kind etched into sealed doors and locked drawers, the kind spoken about only when names were no longer needed. His suit was flawless, pitch black, tailored to precision with not a wrinkle out of place. His shoes kissed the pavement rather than struck it, but each step felt like a gavel. He didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't carry a briefcase. His hands were empty, exposed, deliberate. The rain, which had battered the town all afternoon, seemed to hesitate around him, droplets parting subtly as he crossed through the precinct's sliding doors. Inside, the front desk clerk, barely out of college, looked up from her keyboard and felt the words catch in her throat before they ever reached her tongue. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. He reached into his jacket, not quickly, not slowly, and placed a badge face down on the desk. Leather, worn smooth with use, but unmistakable in weight. She didn't even flip it open. She just nodded. He moved past her like a blade through water. His footsteps down the main corridor didn't echo loudly. They didn't need to. What they left in their wake was not sound, but stillness. Offices grew quieter without a command. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the air felt thinner, as if it had been told to behave. The man didn't check the signs. He didn't ask for directions. He knew exactly where to go. And when he reached the center of the precinct, the operations floor where the energy always buzzed one octave too high, the hum collapsed into hush. 3 officers turned. 2 looked down. 1, Captain Harrelson, a man with 4 decades of command hardened into his spine, instinctively removed his cap and stepped to the side without being asked. The man said nothing. He simply raised the badge again, this time opened. The seal inside catching just enough light to slice through the air. It bore a mark not seen often, not carried by agents or auditors or task force leaders. It was the emblem of unqualified jurisdiction, an executive federal clearance stamped not with rank, but with reach. Harrelson didn't flinch. He'd seen men with badges, guns, and orders, but this was different. This wasn't enforcement. This was an extraction. Then came the first and only question. Who signed the order? The words were calm, sharp, without inflection. Not a voice raised for authority, a voice that didn't need it. Harrelson swallowed. "No order," he replied after too long a pause. "Field discretion." He didn't elaborate. He didn't lie. He knew the weight of even one misplaced word when the speaker didn't carry a weapon, because they never needed to. The man turned from him without comment, walked to the nearest desk terminal, and inserted a small black card into the machine's reader. The screen blinked twice, then went dark. The entire floor of the station followed. One by one, monitors dimmed and cameras disconnected, as if they were machines that had remembered who truly owned them. The internal feed routed without warning, data pouring into a secure channel hundreds of miles away, in a federal data vault never spoken of publicly. No warning, no override, just silence reclaiming what noise had borrowed. The officers stood still, not frozen with confusion, but with instinctual restraint. This was not an intrusion. This was a protocol none of them had been trained to recognize. The man turned again, sweeping the room with a glance that wasn't hostile, wasn't curious, just final. No explanation, no warning, just motion. Down the hall, behind a closed door, Travis Colburn sat in a chair he no longer belonged in. The interview room smelled like old metal and sweat. His collar was unbuttoned. His hands rested on the table, palms up, pretending to look calm. The young liaison from Internal Affairs had asked him to recount the incident again, slower this time. Travis had just begun to spin a familiar defense language, dressed as compliance, policy twisted into a shield, when the door opened. No knock, no clearance call, just the click of a handle and the weight of another presence. The man in the black suit entered with the same composure, no rush, no urgency. He said nothing to the liaison, who stood up automatically and stepped aside. He looked at Travis once, not with disgust, not with judgment, not even recognition. He looked at him the way one might observe a defective machine. Travis blinked. "Sir, I was just explaining." The man raised a hand, not abruptly, slowly, but it cut through the room like a razor. The voice came again, low and surgical. "This room is no longer yours." Travis sat back, the air thickening in his lungs. I need clarification on who you represent." The man didn't smile. He didn't blink. Sentence 3. "Stand. Leave." There was no fourth sentence. Travis stood, his movements mechanical, as if some part of him understood that protest was no longer a useful reflex. He walked out, brushing past a truth he couldn't name. The door closed behind him without force, but with the finality of a sealed case. Now alone, the man in the black suit turned to the room, not to examine it, but to own it. He didn't sit, he didn't look at the chair Lorraine Mitchell had occupied earlier, but his eyes rested briefly on the armrest where a trace of her presence remained, the faintest streak of dried blood, curved and quiet, like a signature left in protest. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The system was no longer in charge. The chain of command had collapsed inward, and the reckoning had arrived without making a sound. The room never recovered after he left it. The man in the black suit hadn't slammed a door, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't spoken more than 4 words in succession, and yet the Chillville precinct was no longer what it had been. Something old and cold had settled into the bones of the building, and no one dared name it. Silence spread like gas. It crept under thresholds and slipped between glances. It hovered behind every monitor, inside every unanswered question. But outside, far beyond the physical borders of that room, the noise only grew louder. Journalists, data miners, and digital sleuths who'd spent the last 24 hours dissecting every second of the Purple Lady footage suddenly hit something harder than confusion. They hit absence. The woman whose image had appeared in a decades-old Summit photo, whose ring had been enhanced and traced by online archivists, whose blood had made the pavement sacred, now had no record, nothing beyond the video, no DMV profile, no federal employment listing, no military affiliation. Not a single document survived a search. Every query came back with the same brutal precision. Access denied. Sealed per Federal Security Protocol FSP 49. For a while, they assumed it was a glitch. Reporters refreshed, reworded, searched alternate spellings, tried cross-referencing through state-level data pools, but it was the same every time. A perfect wall. No one had ever seen a civilian profile disappear in real time. But this wasn't a disappearance, it was intentional redaction. Her name had not been removed, it had been locked. Somewhere behind that firewall, something knew everything and was making damn sure no one else would. One national security correspondent, bold enough to contact a Department of Justice liaison off record, received a 2-word reply: stop digging. The phrase wasn't laced with threat. It didn't need to be. It was too clean, too direct. The kind of warning that didn't threaten consequences because it didn't have to explain what they were. At a global media monitoring firm in Atlanta, an AI system running real-time facial recognition on viral images was given a high-priority query: match the woman from the Chillville footage against archived federal appearances. The request reached the server, was processed, and then crashed. The log noted a fatal error. Seconds later, the AI protocol rebooted, and the woman's face was purged from its dataset permanently. Attempts to reload her into the system triggered an override response labeled only CIVR6 restricted. Archived under OS. No one in the room understood what OS meant. No one dared ask. Elsewhere, an investigative journalist working for a mid-tier publication tried uploading an old conference clip to YouTube. It showed a woman with the same posture, the same ring, seated in the second row of a closed-door security summit. The video had been public for years. Within 37 minutes of upload, it was flagged for review. By hour 2, it was removed. The uploader received a legal notice from the FBI requesting all raw files and issuing a cease and desist, citing national security exceptions under 10 U.S. Code SS 950V. The journalist didn't post again. Somewhere, someone was erasing her. Not sloppily, not urgently, with elegance, with experience. Still, whispers leaked. One reporter tweeted, then quickly deleted, that a classified document from 2009 had once listed her name on the same clearance tier as a former CIA director. A tech policy analyst claimed off-air that he had seen her name associated with a restricted program tied to surveillance ethics. A former DOJ staffer simply posted, "You're not supposed to know her, that's the point." But the posts vanished, the threads were broken, accounts were locked or went quiet, and the public, growing more ravenous by the minute, finally began asking the question no headline dared print: who the hell did we just put in handcuffs? They weren't asking for justice anymore. They were asking for context, because this wasn't about what had been done to a woman. It was about what had been done to someone who didn't exist, someone who, by all accounts, should never have been vulnerable enough to be touched. The contradiction was too sharp. The silence is too precise. The gaps in the record didn't feel like oversight. They felt like architecture, like a system designed not to hide something, but to conceal its very shape. That unease grew into obsession. Hashtags mutated from Purple Lady to Sealed Citizen. Conspiracy forums are flooded. Encryption enthusiasts posted screenshots of metadata showing government tracking pings linked to the original video stream. People began to screenshot everything, paranoid that the footage would vanish overnight. 1,000 theories bloomed, but at the core of all of them sat a still image of her face, turned slightly toward the light, bleeding, unbowed. She had become a question, and no system could survive a question it refused to answer. Within a day, 4 FOIA requests were submitted to different branches of the federal government, seeking any record associated with her arrest, her vehicle, or her name. All 4 were denied. Not delayed, denied. No records available. When a legal blog published the denials side by side, readers noticed that each response had been time-stamped within the same 4-minute window. 4 different departments, 1 silence. Back in Chillville, no one at the precinct mentioned her name out loud anymore. Officers spoke in gestures, eyebrows, nods. The clipboard with her intake had vanished. One officer noticed the paper shredder in the administrative room had jammed that morning. No one asked why. In the dark corners of newsroom war rooms, editors huddled around screenshots like cartographers mapping an abyss. One intern, skimming a cache of 2011 photos from a diplomatic event, froze when he spotted her, standing near the entrance, speaking to no one, watching everything. He showed it to his editor. The photo was published. Within an hour, the publication's website crashed under the load. When it returned, the article was gone. It was becoming clear she wasn't being erased because she was irrelevant. She was being erased because someone had once made the mistake of building her into the architecture, then forgotten what she was made of. And now the nation was beginning to understand what that mistake looked like when caught on tape. They had not cuffed a civilian. They had pulled a thread from a garment no one remembered how to weave. They had pulled the thread, and the silence was no longer enough to contain what unraveled. For 36 hours, the country swirled in questions. The footage played in loops. The sealed files bred speculation, and the woman at the center of it remained unnamed by the very agencies that knew her best. But on the evening of the second day, the story shifted, not with a scream, not with an explosion, but with a statement read in flat cadence by a government anchor, just before the markets closed and just after the last press secretary had been escorted from the podium without taking questions. Tonight, the anchor began, voice even, controlled, almost reverent. The Department of Justice has confirmed the identity of the woman detained in Chillville, Georgia. She is Lorraine D. Mitchell, retired Special Counsel for Civil Protections, former lead investigator of the 2012 Intelligence Ethics Review, ex-advisor to the Joint Oversight Committee on Federal Surveillance, and mother of the sitting United States Attorney General. There was no music, no montage, no flashing breaking graphic, just the sentence, spoken as if carved into the air. The department further confirms, the anchor continued, that Mrs. Mitchell once held Level 6 clearance under the Office of Strategic Programs, with direct access to Project Sentinel and associated protocols between 2005 and 2017. The room behind her remained still. The broadcast cut to archive footage. A grainy clip from a security oversight hearing where a woman in lavender sat quietly behind senators, head slightly bowed, pen in hand. The clip paused, zoomed, and for the first time the public saw the face beneath the blood. Not with violence, not with flash, but with gravity. The story didn't detonate. It moved slower than that, like water rising under a locked door, like pressure finding a crack in a dam. The first aftershock hit Wall Street within the hour. Federal defense contractors bled stock points. Facial recognition firms slid. A half-dozen surveillance startups lost 18% value by closing bell, and a silence heavier than the market moved through every corridor where power once pretended not to know her name. In Chillville, the precinct received its call at 7:42 p.m. Eastern. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. Every commanding officer was to report to the Bureau's Southeast Field Office for immediate federal briefing. No one objected. No one was delayed. Within 30 minutes, 4 unmarked vehicles pulled away from the precinct, taillights vanishing into a dusk now painted with federal red. The station was left with 2 junior patrolmen and a janitor. Inside, in one of the interrogation rooms, now vacant of pretense, Travis sat alone, not in handcuffs, not in uniform, but very, very still. He hadn't asked to be alone. No one had said a word to him in 3 hours. His phone had been removed. His badge was not on his chest. He was no longer waiting for a lawyer. He wasn't even waiting for judgment. He was waiting for definition, for someone, anyone, to tell him what he had done. He had heard the name on the radio in the corner, not from an officer, not from a superior, from the thin, static voice of a news anchor speaking to millions, unaware that the man who had bent Lorraine Mitchell's wrists and crushed her against a hood still sat beneath flickering fluorescent light in silence thick as syrup. His lips had parted at the first mention of Mother of the Attorney General, but no sound followed. His eyes did not blink during the confirmation of Project Sentinel, and when the phrase held Level 6 clearance cut through the room, his hands slowly lifted from his lap and folded themselves, like they no longer trusted him with their autonomy. The air around him was different now, not charged, not afraid, just cold. Elsewhere, across the country, reactions didn't scream. They recalibrated. Political strategists deleted scheduled posts. Think tanks canceled Friday panels. A memo from a private equity firm paused donations to 2 sheriff unions. Intelligence subcommittees entered emergency review. Not because a woman had been brutalized, not because the nation was angry, but because now they had a name. And the name came with a map. People remembered the hearings she'd once attended, the memos she'd written that never leaked but always shifted how rules were applied. They recalled the one time she spoke at a closed summit and asked, on record, who watches the watchers, if not someone who's buried next to them. They remembered that she had retired without a fuss, declined interviews, refused memoir deals, and slipped into quiet like a dagger into silk. And now they had put her in cuffs, in public, on video, without knowing who she was. That mistake was not procedural, it was existential. There was no press conference from the Attorney General, no tears, no retribution, just a 2-sentence, official memo sent from her office to the heads of all relevant departments. Sentence 1, my mother has always taught me to let others speak first. Sentence 2, this time I will listen. It was not a rebuke, it was a warning in velvet. That evening, as satellite trucks began to crowd the quiet streets of Chillville, no reporter dared step beyond the barriers now patrolled by silent agents. No interviews were given, no comment released. The only visible shift came at the town's war memorial, where someone had laid a single branch of lavender beneath the wall of honor. No plaque, no ribbon, just a bloom. Lorraine Mitchell, still unspoken by voice but roared by reputation, remained under observation, not because she needed protection, but because, for the first time in a very long time, the system did. And Travis Colburn, who had once drawn his baton without a name, now sat like a shadow peeled from its source, pale, unspeaking, suspended in a room that felt smaller with every breath. Travis Colburn sat alone, and the room no longer contained him. It abandoned him. Hours had passed since the name Lorraine D. Mitchell had folded itself into the air like a gavel lowered on a coffin, and still the precinct hadn't recovered. It didn't scream, it didn't burn. It simply quieted, like a body already beginning to forget how to circulate its blood. At first, no one said a word. Then, slowly the officers began to leave. Some called it a vacation. Some said it was for mental health. A few walked out mid-shift and never returned. None turned in their badges. None cleaned out their lockers. They just slipped away. By morning, the roll call board was blank in more than half the rows. The night desk was manned by a reserve officer barely out of the academy who kept checking the entrance like someone was about to walk in and revoke reality. The hallway, where radio chatter usually echoed, now pulsed with dead air. Phones rang longer. Coffee is brewed colder, and the fluorescent lights, once sharp and humming, now flickered at random intervals, like they too had stopped trying. No announcements were made, no commands were given. The captain didn't speak. He didn't need to. His office remained shut, the blinds never drawn, his silhouette behind the glass frozen in perpetual stillness. Every officer who passed that door slowed, just slightly, as if the air grew heavier near it. No one knocked. No one dared ask what he was writing, or if he was writing at all, but those who looked long enough said his stare had changed, not with fear, not even with regret, but with a kind of quiet indictment, like a man watching a structure collapse that he had once helped build, brick by brick. In the corner of the briefing room, where the caseboard had once been covered in clipped mugshots and warrants, there was now only one sheet of paper pinned dead center, an anonymous, handwritten note with no salutation, no signature, just a single line in block letters. She was untouchable, and you touched her. No one admitted to putting it there. No one dared take it down. Down the hall, Travis remained confined to holding, not under arrest, not yet charged, just waiting in a gray-walled limbo that no longer had the energy to pretend it was lawful. The uniform had been taken. His belt, phone, and keys, too. But the smirk hadn't left his face entirely. It lingered at the corners, cracked and taut, like paint on a wall too long ignored. He leaned back in his chair and wore his silence like armor, still convinced it was the world that had lost its mind, not him. Still, certain he had only done his job, but something had changed. Not in how he carried himself, but in the way the room no longer responded to him. No more glances, no more backup, no more shared jokes through clenched jaws. The others didn't look at him now, or if they did, it was with the dull resignation of someone watching a man drown in a pool he'd pissed in. That afternoon, Sergeant Peters, 32 years in, decorated twice, the kind of man who used to nod at Travis like they shared a pact, stood outside the holding room and stared at him through the glass. Not long, not accusatory, just long enough. Travis met his gaze, expecting acknowledgement, maybe even alliance. Instead, Peters spoke without entering. "You think we're gonna die on this hill for you?" Travis didn't answer, but the look in his eyes flickered, just once. Not shame, not fear, something more dangerous, confusion. As if for the first time, the possibility was dawning that the brotherhood he counted on might not bleed for him. By nightfall, 3 more officers submitted leave requests. 2 removed their nameplates from their desks. A junior lieutenant returned his badge directly into the captain's office, placed it on the desk without a word, turned, and left. The captain never looked up. Outside the building, beneath the glare of a weak streetlight that buzzed more than it glowed, someone had taped a printed image to the front door. It was blurry, printed off an old desktop printer, edges curling in the mist. A screenshot from the footage. Lorraine Mitchell's face, blood trailing down her temple, eyes open, unblinking. Beneath it, typed in 24-point bold, "Bold, you know what you did." No one removed it, no one touched it. The tape held through wind and drizzle. The silence wasn't peaceful, it wasn't restorative. It was decay. Slow, unseen, the kind that worked from the inside out. The kind that hollowed things before anyone realized they were empty. The front desk stopped logging incoming calls. Evidence clerks stopped filing chain of custody reports. One by one, systems softened. Procedures were followed in name only, and no one dared file paperwork on Travis. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because no one wanted to put their signature next to his. Somewhere in a back closet, a janitor found the remnants of Lorraine's intake form, crumpled, torn twice. One line still visible, written in bold ink at the top. Mitchell, Lorraine D. Below it, one word had been circled. Hold. The paper was never filed. The janitor folded it again and slid it into the bottom of the trash, not because he wanted to hide it, but because the idea of throwing it out felt like complicity. By the 3rd day, the precinct functioned in ritual only. Doors opened and closed, radios buzzed with static, but the heart of the place was missing. Not broken, removed. The sounds were still there, but the meaning had gone. And Travis, still in his room, still untouched by indictment or apology, finally began to pace, not with anxiety, with calculation. The cracks in his confidence didn't roar. They clicked, quietly, like fractures behind drywall. He still believed he could explain it, still believed the policies would protect him, still believed that if someone just laid out the facts, they'd see his side. But with every hour that passed, and every pair of boots that walked out without looking back, the story he told himself began to rot from the center. No one came to see him, no one briefed him, the lawyers hadn't called, and somewhere in that absence, Travis finally began to feel the weight of something he couldn't define. Not guilt, not responsibility, but isolation. Not because the world had turned on him, because it had left him behind. And the walls of the Chillville precinct were still cold when the doors closed in Washington. There were no press releases, no motorcades, no names etched on the frosted glass. Only a single room buried 2 levels below the Department of Justice, sealed behind 4 layers of badge clearance, and a silence enforced more by legacy than protocol. Inside, the room smelled of paper, filtered air, and consequence. The Attorney General didn't sit at the head of the table. She didn't need to. Power didn't move through shape. It moved through direction. And in this room, everything pointed to her. 7 seats were filled. 3 former federal judges, gray-suited, long-faced men who wore their neutrality like ancient armor. 2 senior DOJ policy directors, one of whom still held the pen used to sign the Patriot Act revisions, a national representative from the NAACP, whose silence had lasted 2 days longer than the media could understand, and at the center, standing, not speaking yet, the woman whose voice now bent the room more than the laws ever could. On the table, no refreshments, no folders, just one item, printed on standard paper, slightly smudged in black and white. The still frame from the viral video. Lorraine Mitchell, mid-Mamer, her face half-turned, eyes open, cheeks streaked with blood. The windshield spider-webbed behind her like a fracture through the nation's spine. The picture lay flat. No one touched it. The Attorney General broke the silence first. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't falter. It came with the restraint of someone who had been trained to deliver sentences that lived longer than memory. "I've read your drafts," she said. "I've reviewed your impact assessments. None of it accounts for what happens next." The oldest judge shifted, folding his hands, his cufflinks silent. "We're in unknown territory." "No," she replied. "We're exactly where we've always been. We've just stopped lying to ourselves about the coordinates." One of the DOJ men cleared his throat, voice dry. "There's an appetite on the Hill for a contained response, a scapegoat. One officer. Isolate him. Cut it out before it spreads." The woman from the NAACP finally leaned forward. "They tried that after Selma, after Watts, after Ferguson. Cutting doesn't cure rot." The second judge exhaled. "What exactly are we here to authorize?" The Attorney General turned toward the screen behind them, black, inactive. With a nod, an aide flipped it on. The video played without sound, just visuals. The baton, the shattered glass, the hand with the ring, the blood, the posture, and the stillness. When it ended, the room didn't move. Then she said, "You're here to decide whether we try a man or indict the machine that built him." There was no motion, no outcry, only a moment of collective stillness, as if each man had been quietly handed a verdict with their name on it. The third judge leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice soft. "Trying a system means pulling threads we can't control. Decades, precedents, whole departments. Then let's name the thread," the Attorney General replied, each word like a pin through the national skin. "Chillville is a test, but it's not a singularity. If we pretend it is, we validate the next Travis Colburn before he even graduates the academy." The first DOJ official tried to redirect. "There are risks," she cut him cleanly, "and there are risks to continuing as if my mother weren't Lorraine Mitchell. She didn't walk through fire, so you could ask if the heat might sting." The silence after that wasn't uncomfortable. It was inevitable, the kind that only happens when history steps into the room uninvited. At 11:47 a.m., a one-page memo was approved unanimously. It bore no formal name, no timestamp for the press, just 3 lines. "The Federal Special Oversight Authority is granted immediate operational clearance. All personnel relevant to the Chillville incident are subject to inquiry without limitation. Deploy within 24 hours. The memo was uploaded to a closed federal server at 11:53. No fax, no email, no trail. By noon, a plane had been cleared for priority airspace southbound. The decision was not public, not procedural, not even strategic. It was personal. Lorraine D. Mitchell did not request a convoy, a podium, or a flight back to Washington. She declined interviews, refused legal briefings, and ignored suggestions that the nation needed to see her standing tall. What she needed was smaller, quieter, sharper. She asked for a room, not in D.C., not in court, in Chillville. One room, no windows, no microphone, no camera, no transcript. She asked for the one thing the system never expects a survivor to demand: a conversation. Travis Colburn was told only this: there would be no attorneys present, no recording, no audience, and no questions asked of him, unless he chose to speak. He didn't understand why he was being walked down the hallway instead of dragged. He didn't know why no one had cuffed him, even now. He thought about refusing, he thought about posturing, but he also knew, somehow, that this wasn't the kind of invitation one declined without consequence. So he followed, silent, led by a single federal official who neither greeted nor looked at him. When the door opened, he stepped inside. The room was clinical, but not cruel. 4 walls, 1 table, 2 chairs. The lights were low but not dark. It had the feel of something carefully designed to be neither welcoming nor threatening, a holding space between confession and consequence. Travis sat down first, palms flat on the cold steel. His knuckles were pale, but his spine held steady. He looked toward the door once before it opened again, and then she entered. She wore no suit, no statement piece, no color at all, but the deep charcoal of a long wool shawl that fell past her waist like a shadow you could fold. Her pace was neither fast nor slow. It was final. She looked at him without blinking, not with rage, not with pity. She closed the door behind her, not gently, but deliberately. Her hand left the handle with the precision of someone who had locked many doors behind her in her life, each one heavier than this. She sat without ceremony. He almost said something, almost cleared his throat, almost asked what this was for. But before the instinct could take hold, she spoke, and her voice moved through the space with a quiet that demanded no amplification. "Have you ever looked at a person," she said, "and seen them fully, not their clothes, not their license plate, not their compliance level? A person with a story that started long before you stepped into it." Travis hesitated, his mouth caught half open. I followed protocol?" Her head tilted slightly, not in disbelief, not in mockery, just enough to signal that the words had passed through her without friction. "Protocol," she repeated, soft but unflinching. "That's the shield." He nodded. "Quickly, too quickly. You're trained to spot patterns, not people." Her voice did not rise. "You didn't see me. You saw the data. And then you saw a threat, and then you saw nothing." Travis bristled, then leaned forward, elbows on the table now, trying to root himself in something familiar. "I had reason, suspicion, the tags, the behavior, non-compliance. You refused to answer." She didn't flinch. "I didn't hear you. I'm nearly deaf in my left ear. You mistook a medical condition for defiance." He blinked. She continued, "The second time you shouted, I turned my head, and your hand went for your weapon. You didn't wait for an explanation. You didn't offer one. You escalated a moment that only required patience." He looked down, briefly, but his voice fought to stay upright. "It wasn't personal, but it happened to a person," she replied, voice flat as a blade. "That's the part you never learned to account for." There was no condemnation in her tone. No performance. Every sentence was delivered like a mirror, not to reflect guilt, but to reveal absence. Travis shifted in his seat, not from fear, but from the slow, creeping sensation that the room had shrunk around him. Not physically, but morally. He forced a breath through his nose. "I didn't know who you were. And that," she said, "was your first mistake. Because I was someone, even if I had no title, even if I were no one's mother, even if I'd never sat behind a classified desk or written an oversight policy. I was someone still." He looked up, finally holding her gaze. "I wasn't trying to dehumanize you. You didn't need to try, you just needed to obey." He swallowed. "I didn't mean harm." "But harm doesn't wait for intention," she answered. "It lives in indifference." There was no shift in her posture, no dramatic pause, no flourish. She spoke the way iron cools, slow, steady, and irreversible. Travis sat back. He had no script for this. There was no defense to mount against something that never aimed to attack. He crossed his arms, not to close off, but to hold himself still. "What do you want from me?" he asked, quieter now. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing? I didn't come to redeem you or convict you. I came to ask if you've ever truly looked." "At what?" "At a human being," she said, "and not seen paperwork, not seen the protocol, not seen risk scores, just seen them." He didn't answer. She stood. He rose too, almost instinctively. She paused at the door, one hand on the knob, and said one final thing, not with venom, not with weight, but with clarity, sharp enough to cut through the air like a scalpel through tissue. "The system taught you how to enforce. It never taught you how to see." And then she left. She left the room without slamming the door, without looking back, and without leaving a single instruction behind. Yet in her wake, the country moved. Not in panic, not in rage, but in rhythm. Slow at first, deliberate, and then unmistakable. It began not with orders, but with color. One person wore purple on a morning train in Chicago. Another wore it across the shoulders during a coffee run in Philadelphia. In Denver, a schoolteacher hung a violet scarf from the rearview mirror of her car. No slogans, no hashtags, just color. By dusk, it had become more than a gesture. It became a language. Entire blocks bled lavender and plum. Deep eggplant fabric wrapped around storefronts. Violet banners stretched across balconies. And still, no one shouted. The crowds didn't gather to chant. They gathered to stand. In Los Angeles, hundreds filled Pershing Square in silence, hands tucked in pockets, heads uncovered to the sky. In Detroit, they lined the steps of the old federal courthouse, shoulders touching, breathing as one. In D.C., the streets near the Capitol swelled with people not looking to demand, but to remind. The purple didn't mean politics, it meant memory and a promise not to forget. They carried signs, but none screamed. Some were handwritten, others laser-printed in haste. The ink bled slightly from the weight of damp air, but the message held. We saw her. She stood alone, so now we stand with her. Silence is not the same as safety. In Chillville, it was not the size of the crowd, but the precision of its stillness that made the world stop. There were no marching bands, no megaphones, no flyers. Just people, rows and rows of them, from the church steps to the intersection where Lorraine had once been dragged out of her vehicle. The streets held their breath. Children in purple jackets clutched the hands of parents who had warned them about what the world could be. Elderly men sat on folding chairs, canes balanced between their knees, purple ribbons pinned to their hats. One girl, 12 years old, arms trembling slightly, held a cardboard sign scrawled in marker. "You smashed the wrong car." She didn't speak, she didn't smile, but she stood as if the ground had asked her to. Next to her, a man in full military dress stood still. The medals on his chest did not gleam. They waited. His voice, when it came, was low, directed at a single camera held by a journalist whose lens had been fogged by the morning humidity. "She's the reason I made it home," he said, each word falling like a stone in a lake. "Not because she served with me, but because when I came back angry and broken, she didn't look away." The clip went viral before the march ended. Across social media, the color purple became the new algorithm. Filters, profile overlays, digital ribbons, but none of it carried vanity. It carried weight. Purple March trended not because it was catchy, but because it told the truth without a scream. Celebrities posted photos in silence. Activists quoted Lorraine's words. A public figure shared an old voicemail where she had once said, "Justice isn't loud, it's steady." People wept, but not in performance. They wept because someone had said what they never could. And still, no one made her a martyr, because she wasn't gone, because she had not asked for a movement, because the march wasn't for her, It was because of her. At the edge of Chillville, a long aerial shot taken from a drone captured the curve of the street, lined with thousands of people, each one wearing some shade of defiance stitched into their chest. From above, it looked like a river, calm, unified, unstoppable. Back at the precinct, the windows remained dark. Inside, the air felt colder, not from shame, but from absence. No one opened the blinds. No one stepped outside. The station no longer belonged to the people who built it. It belonged to the silence that surrounded it. The silence that followed the Purple March was not an absence. It was present in its purest form, a presence that filled streets, inboxes, pulpits, and television studios with a clarity words alone could not summon. Lorraine D. Mitchell did not speak to the crowds. She did not wave from balconies. She did not give interviews, but somewhere behind those closed doors in Chillville, behind walls that had absorbed more noise than any building should have to hold, she wrote, not for the world, for her daughter. The letter was not a statement, not a declaration, not a strategic memo meant to navigate headlines or appease constituencies. It was ink on cream-colored paper, handwritten in a script that bore the steady weight of someone who knew exactly how long it takes for a word to live past the moment it's written. There were no legal references, no mention of the baton, no indictment, no plea, only a voice shaped not by pain, but by principle, and a mother speaking not as a victim, but as a compass. My daughter, you carry many titles now. Some were earned through study, some through fire, and some, I suspect, were carved into your shoulders by people who hoped the weight might bend you. But I have watched you stand. I have watched you listen, longer than most men speak. I have watched you give answers where silence would have been easier. This country may see a cabinet member. I still see a girl who once recited the preamble to the Constitution from memory and then asked me why the word posterity sounded like it had more to do with sorrow than the future. You were right. I am not writing to talk about what happened to me. The world already has footage for that. They have images, angles, think pieces. They will not forget. That is no longer my burden. What I write to you now is not about my pain. It is about your purpose. Lorraine's handwriting curved inward slightly. The letters elegant but strong, never rushed. She had always written like that, slowly, intentionally, the way one might set down stones to mark a trail. A long time ago, I attended a memorial service in Greensboro for a man I'd once worked with during a federal ethics investigation. I didn't speak that day. I sat in the third pew from the back. It was a hot Sunday, no air conditioning. The windows were open, and the fans made more noise than air. At some point, a young man in uniform was asked to lead a reading. He stood up tall, still half boy, nervous, and instead of reading, he sang. It wasn't perfect. His voice cracked. He missed a note, but it was honest. You don't hear honesty often from people trained to say everything by procedure. That boy was a police officer, probably not older than 22, and in that moment I thought, he still believes. He still thinks justice is worth the sound of his voice breaking in front of strangers. Most men in his shoes would have kept their heads down and done the minimum. He chose to be heard. I don't remember his name. I never asked for it, but I remember the way the room changed after he sang. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was grateful, because for a moment we were reminded that uniforms don't have to erase the human being inside them. I tell you this because you now hold the pen that signs policies that affect people like him. And people like me. You now write rules that outlive sentiment. You must remember, the law is not the end point. It is the language we build between right and wrong, and it only means something if the people writing it have learned how to listen. Lorraine didn't cross out a single word. She didn't edit. Her tone never wavered into nostalgia or righteousness. It remained steady, a line drawn without shaking. You will be asked to make someone pay for what happened. You will be told to punish, to act, to reassure the public that accountability is swift. But I ask you this, do not sacrifice what is right for what is immediate. Don't mistake rage for clarity. Don't confuse punishment with transformation. And above all, Do not let that young man who once sang ever have to lower his voice just to survive in a system that fears softness more than violence. Let him sing again. Let the ones like him know that their honesty has a place in the house of justice, not just their compliance. You are not just my daughter. You are a steward now. Stewardship means holding fire without burning the floor beneath your feet. It means choosing not to shout when everyone else demands thunder. It means understanding that the law is not your sword. It is your reflection. No closing flourish. No final breath of sentiment, only a simple line written smaller than the rest, as if it were not meant for reproduction, but for remembrance. Always, Ma. The letter was delivered by hand, not courier, in a plain white envelope. The Attorney General received it in her private office. She read it alone, early, before the morning briefings, before the phones started ringing, before anyone could interrupt what it meant. She did not weep. She did not call a press conference. She placed the letter in a drawer. But someone close to her, no one said who, took a photo of the one sentence that had been underlined lightly by Lorraine's hand. Don't let that boy have to bow his head just because he wears the uniform. The photo was posted to Twitter. It spread across platforms in seconds, not because it was viral, because it was true. The nation had marched in silence, stood in purple, and wept without spectacle, but grief, like heat, rises, and eventually it reaches the screens. It was prime time when they aired at 8:00 p.m. East Coast. The slot once reserved for breaking news now served as a civic tribunal. The title read like a dare. Justice or just a name? The show wasn't new, but that night it wasn't entertainment. It was tension disguised in lighting and soft graphics. The studio was cool, overproduced, engineered for control, but it couldn't suppress the sharp current beneath every exchange. The guests were seated for symmetry, not safety, 2 on each side of the table. The moderator centered like a surgeon about to make the first cut. Commissioner Howard Drexler sat like a man balancing a badge on his conscience. 40 years in uniform, 30 with a desk, his voice carried the gravity of someone who had seen too much and admitted too little. Next to him, Amelia Langston, a white former prosecutor, poised and perfectly composed, her tone always 3 degrees colder than the fire it masked. On the other side, Marissa Hale, a civil rights attorney with eyes that didn't blink for decorum, sat with her hands folded like a prayer she no longer offered. Beside her, Ellis Brandt, investigative journalist, face weathered by riots, reporting, and a lifetime of watching truth get buried beneath legalese and airtime. The host, Daniel Voss, didn't smile. "We begin," he said, "not with debate but with the image." Again, the screen flickered, then filled with the clip. No music, no narration, just raw footage. Lorraine Mitchell, dragged from her car, blood on the glass, violet sleeves soaked, her face turned not in defiance but in refusal to disappear. The silence in the studio wasn't editorial, it was involuntary. When the clip ended, Voss turned to Drexler. "Commissioner, was this a mistake or a symptom?" Drexler exhaled slowly. "It was a moment of failure, a misjudgment, not indicative of the system." Hale replied before Voss could. "Not indicative? This isn't the first woman brutalized in daylight. It's just the first whose bloodline made us care." Langston cut in. "You're suggesting only power grants visibility?" Brandt answered, "No. We're suggesting that without power this would have been a footnote. Or no note at all." Drexler's voice tightened. "That officer didn't act out of hate," Hale said. "He acted out of habit, which is worse, because it means no one even noticed anymore." Voss turned slightly. "Ms. Langston, you wrote that this moment risks becoming symbolic, not structural. Elaborate." Langston's reply was smooth. "We risk turning her into a martyr and forgetting to fix the architecture. Justice isn't optics, it's operational." Brandt shook his head. "But the optics show us what the system hides. If the cameras hadn't caught that moment, would we even know her name?" Hale added, "We didn't see justice. We saw clarity, for once. That's why people marched, not for a verdict, but for a mirror." Voss nodded slowly, pivoting. "Let's ask the question bluntly. If Lorraine Mitchell weren't the mother of the Attorney General, would we be here? The air thinned. Langston hesitated. Probably not, Drexler added. And that is a failure of us all. Hale, unwavering. No, that is a failure of those who built the rules and pretend surprise when they function as designed. Voss allowed a beat. Commissioner Drexler, what would accountability look like here? Drexler spoke measuredly. The officer should be disciplined, reviewed, but we must also protect due process. Brandt leaned forward. You don't owe due process to patterns, you owe it to people. And she wasn't a pattern, she was a precedent. Langston challenged him. That's dangerous thinking. You risk collapsing individualized justice. Hale said, justice isn't collapsed. It's been tilted so long we stopped seeing the angle. Voss moved the conversation. Ms. Hale, you've said justice must redefine itself in public spaces, not just courtrooms. Yes, she answered, because courtrooms are built to filter truth. But the public saw what no court would admit, a woman treated like a threat until her credentials proved otherwise. Langston replied, so we're to treat all interactions like potential PR nightmares? No, Hale said, we're to treat all people like people, whether or not they come with clearance. Voss paused again, letting silence be the fifth guest. Final question. Each of you, what does justice look like tomorrow morning? As Drexler. Balanced action, not emotional backlash. Langston, a measured response that acknowledges error without demolishing structure. Branch. Structural demolition is overdue. Hale, justice is when we no longer need a title to survive a traffic stop. Then Voss turned to the camera, the same way he had before every rating spike or national apology, but this time he didn't deliver a summary. Instead, he asked again, if Lorraine Mitchell had been anyone else, anyone without history, without bloodlines, without legacy, would she have been pulled from that car differently? Would she have been pulled at all? No one answered, and the broadcast faded to black, not with credits, but with silence. The silence that followed the televised panel didn't dissolve, it settled in homes, in classrooms, in inboxes and open browser tabs that no longer switch away from the footage. The country had grown used to noise, but now it sat with a quiet that didn't ask for headlines, it asked for testimony. The next hearing wasn't scheduled as a spectacle, it wasn't a show trial, it was procedural, subdued, a chamber designed for policy. But that day, policy took a seat behind a 12-year-old girl named Amira James. Her name wasn't on any placard, her face had not appeared on breaking news graphics, but her live stream, shaky and framed too high, had been the first to show Lorraine Mitchell's face pressed against the hood of a car, blood tracing the edge of her jaw like punctuation on a sentence never meant to be spoken. Amira hadn't planned to become part of the story. She was walking home from school with her phone in hand, watching the world like any other kid, until she saw a world she couldn't unsee. The invitation to the hearing arrived by letter. It wasn't formal, not at first. Her mother read it 3 times before agreeing. No handlers, no talking points, just a chair, a microphone, and a name was added to the witness list. When Amira entered the room, it felt too large. Her shoes squeaked on the floor, and the space smelled like books no one read anymore. The walls were tall and beige, the table polished but dull, and every chair around it seemed made for someone taller, louder, older. But she didn't shrink. She adjusted her sleeves, exhaled once through her nose, and walked forward with a pace that said, I've seen something I shouldn't have seen, and I'm still here. The chairman welcomed her politely. He did not smile. He asked if she understood why she was there. She nodded. The clerk swore her in, voice slow, careful, not condescending, but almost reverent. When she sat, her feet didn't touch the floor. She gripped the microphone too tightly at first, then loosened her fingers and waited for the room to breathe. I don't know everything about the law, she began. Her voice was clear, high but steady, as if reading from a diary she hadn't meant to share, but decided was necessary. I'm just a kid. I don't know how courts work. I don't understand police procedures. I can't tell you what articles or amendments mean in courtrooms, but I know what I saw. Pause. Not theatrical, real. I saw a lady sitting still. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't hurting anyone. She was just sitting, and then the glass broke, and I heard yelling, and I saw blood, and I didn't understand how that could happen in front of everybody. The panel didn't interrupt. I filmed it because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I just told them. I was scared. I thought if I ran away, I'd feel worse later. So I stayed. I filmed. She looked down for a second, blinked, continued. I didn't post it to go viral. I didn't want people to follow me. I didn't even show my face. I posted it because I thought maybe if enough people saw it, someone would say it was wrong, and maybe someone would stop it from happening again. A single member of the committee leaned forward slightly, hands folded. Amira glanced at him, then continued. She didn't deserve that. No one does. I don't care what her job was. I didn't even know who she was until later. I just saw an old woman get hurt by someone who was supposed to protect her, and it made my chest hurt, like I couldn't breathe right. Another pause. Her hands gripped the edge of the table now, not from nerves, but from the pressure of telling the truth while still figuring out what the truth meant. I'm not trying to get anyone fired. I'm not trying to say all police are bad. My uncle is a cop. He helped me learn how to ride a bike. But even he said what happened wasn't okay. He said sometimes the badge makes people forget they're still just people. No one in the room wrote anything down, but the words were already etched somewhere deeper. I'm scared, she admitted, not just of what happened, but of what happens next. I'm scared it won't matter, that people will forget, that they'll say it was just one bad moment, or one bad officer. But it wasn't just that. It was a big moment, and it made me feel like I live in a place where I could sit down one day, and someone might think I'm dangerous just because of how I look. Her voice cracked then, not a sob, a fracture. She pressed her lips together, inhaled, continued. But I also know something else, that if we pretend we didn't see it, then it's like we're saying it's okay, and it's not. The panel chair asked gently, "Do you have anything else you'd like to say?" She nodded. Yeah. Then she looked straight ahead. I hope one day I get to grow up in a place where I don't have to film things like that again. I hope adults fix it before my little brother has to learn how to be scared. No applause, no questions, just a stillness that lasted too long to be called silence. And then she stepped down, her sneakers tapping against the floor, echoing a little more softly than when she entered, but leaving behind something far louder than her voice. The echo of Amira's voice still hovered in the country's consciousness like a thread stretched too thin but never quite snapping. Her truth, spoken without polish or pretense, had reached deeper than most legislation ever would. But in the aftermath of that piercing honesty, something else began to shift, not on the steps of courthouses or the streets of protest, but inside the sealed, stale corridors of institutions. One of them was Chillville's police department, and at its center stood a man whose name hadn't yet made the headlines, but whose shadow had lingered for decades. Chief Nolan Greeley had been head of Chillville PD for 18 years. Before that, he was deputy chief, and before that, a street sergeant with a reputation for discipline through intimidation. As one former colleague put it, his face never appeared in any of the live streams, not once, not even in the background blur of badge clusters. He hadn't been at the scene of Lorraine Mitchell's assault, but now the spotlight he had so carefully dodged for years had finally found him, and this time it brought paperwork. It started with a leak. An anonymous PDF file was posted by a former internal affairs officer under the pseudonym Retired Not Blind. The file contained 9 separate complaint summaries against Chief Greeley, dating back 15 years. Each accusation involved alleged racially charged behavior, disproportionately aggressive stops, or cover-ups of similar behavior by officers under his command. Each complaint had been cleared due to insufficient evidence, closed without further action, or referred to mediation and subsequently dropped. But the most chilling part wasn't in the conclusions. It was in the language of the reports themselves. Phrases like pattern of hostile demeanor toward elderly black citizens and repeatedly refers to minority female civilians with degrading terminology, appeared without redaction. One line, attributed to an officer whose name had been blacked out but later confirmed through court testimony, read, "He told us, every old black lady is a ticking time bomb. You just don't know what decade she's angry about." The quote landed like a coffin being shut. At first, Greeley denied everything. He issued a terse statement through the department's PR firm. "These accusations are baseless, decades old, and manufactured by disgruntled former personnel." But his voice trembled slightly when he read it in front of reporters. His eyes darted too fast for comfort. No officer stood behind him, and for the first time in recent memory, no city council member rushed to his defense. Within 24 hours, an ex-lieutenant named Thomas Riggins came forward on record. Retired 5 years, no longer receiving a pension, Riggins spoke from his front porch, not from a podium. "I remember when he said it," Riggins told reporters. "We were outside a welfare center doing crowd control. A black woman walked by holding her granddaughter's hand, and Nolan looked at her like she was radiation. He said it with a smirk. He meant it. When asked why he hadn't come forward before, Riggins didn't hesitate. Because you don't ruin your career in that building. You survive it. But I'm not trying to survive anymore." Then came the files. Local journalists, galvanized by the leak, began requesting public records. What they found was a system of internal redactions so complete it could have been a tutorial in bureaucratic insulation. Dozens of body cam recordings flagged but never reviewed. Citizen complaints are closed within 72 hours without interviews. Training reports rewritten. Community outreach programs quietly shuttered under Greeley's tenure, replaced with increased funding for riot gear. The most damning piece didn't come from a whistleblower but from the city's archives, a training manual authored under Greeley's supervision in 2011 that contained a module titled Recognizing Hostile Indicators. Among the examples listed were excessive eye contact, slow compliance, and verbal resistance through historical grievance language. The implication was grotesque. History itself, or the act of referencing it, had been reclassified as threat behavior. Greeley's defenders tried to salvage his image. A former mayor called him a stabilizing force. A police union spokesman described the investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt. But the air had already changed. The words couldn't be unsaid. The paperwork couldn't be shredded fast enough. And the city, quietly, began to flinch whenever his name was spoken aloud. He stopped showing up to meetings. He stopped speaking to the press. And then he stopped being mentioned altogether. No one fired him. No one indicted him, but he vanished. When reporters called the department to confirm whether he was still active, they were redirected or stonewalled. One staffer finally admitted off the record, "He's not in the office, but we haven't been told he's out." It was the bureaucratic version of exile. Not absolution, not condemnation, just disappear. Meanwhile, the department's walls cracked, not physically, but structurally. Officers stopped backing each other blindly. Younger recruits requested transfers. Community liaisons resigned. Several retired early. The department still existed on paper, still operated, still responded to calls, but the faith that once held it together, the belief that their leader, though harsh, was fair, was gone. The public didn't riot. They didn't demand blood. They just stopped pretending that oversight had ever really meant accountability, pretending that insufficient evidence wasn't often code for "we never looked," pretending that a man like Nolan Greeley, who had built a career on silence, was somehow separate from the silence that had allowed everything else to happen. By the end of the week, the city council scheduled a closed-door vote on his status, but by then, his office was already empty. His nameplate is gone. No press release, no farewell. Just a department waiting for orders that would never come. And in the corner of the precinct lobby, someone had taped a printed quote. One of the lines from Amira's testimony, scribbled in marker underneath, "If we pretend we didn't see it, it's like we're saying it's okay." No one took it down. The building didn't breathe anymore. Chillville Police Department had become a husk of fluorescent silence. a mausoleum for names no one said aloud. After the storm of hearings, press releases, resignations, and leaked histories, there was nothing left to deny, only things left to forget. Lorraine D. Mitchell didn't belong to that forgetting. She had never asked to be remembered. She simply was never permitted to be erased. Her departure wasn't scheduled. No motorcade, no reporters outside, no final address. The black SUV that waited for her outside the side entrance was just a vehicle, but everything about it felt like a closing door. Not slammed, not dramatic, just firm. Deliberate. She stepped inside without assistance. Her posture, always regal in a way that made people wonder if she'd been trained in it, was intact. She didn't glance at the precinct behind her. She didn't need to. That chapter had already folded itself shut. The vehicle rolled forward without a sound. The new windshield gleamed under a weak afternoon sun. It had replaced the one shattered by force, the one that had tried to erase her dignity with tempered glass and the panic of a man who saw a threat in quiet. The new glass was seamless, invisible, the way silence pretends nothing ever happened. Lorraine turned her head slightly, not because she wanted to see the town, but because she hadn't looked at it since the moment it turned against itself. The buildings wore a different kind of wear now. Not age, exposure. There's a difference between decay and revelation. Chillville had begun to rot long before anyone filmed it, but now people could smell it in the concrete. She adjusted her collar. It was the same violet blouse, laundered, restitched at the shoulder. The bloodstain was gone, but the fabric held memory like breath in a closed room. She didn't fix it for anyone else. She fixed it because sometimes, even after surviving something meant to strip you, you still make sure the mirror sees you whole. The SUV passed an elementary school. Outside the chain-link fence, a cluster of children played. They were too young to know why cameras had filled their town, but they knew colors and symbols. One girl, maybe 7 or 8, saw the vehicle, saw the woman behind the glass, and ran closer, not recklessly, but with a purpose. She stopped, pressed a palm against the window, said nothing, but her eyes held everything. "She looks like my grandma," the girl whispered to herself. Inside, Lorraine saw the gesture. She did not lower the glass. She did not wave. Her hand remained in her lap, but her gaze didn't break. She looked at the child not like a monument looks at the crowd, but like a future looks back at its origin. Not with sentiment, with certainty. The car moved on. At the last intersection before the highway, the driver slowed. Perhaps out of habit, the road had once been blocked with signs, chants, and bodies willing to become barricades against indifference. Now it was just pavement again. But pavement remembers the feet that refused to keep walking. Every march leaves behind a kind of echo, not loud, not replayable, but present. Lorraine didn't speak. She didn't ask about the route. The silence in the car wasn't awkward. It was earned. Not all journeys end with noise. Some end with the refusal to narrate. Some end with someone finally having nothing left to prove. The rearview mirror caught her profile. Strong, untouched by apology. There had been no apology, only explanation. Explanations are what people give when they fear consequences, but not guilt. She had watched entire departments rewrite themselves in real time, but she had not rewritten herself. She had not corrected her voice. She had simply spoken less and let the silence become an indictment. As the last streetlight faded behind them, Lorraine reached into her coat. From a hidden pocket, she pulled a folded piece of paper. It wasn't legal, it wasn't evidence. It was a screenshot, printed on plain white paper. It showed the face of a girl, Amira, standing at a podium. Eyes wide but unmoving, Lorraine stared at it for a full 30 seconds, not because she needed to remember the moment, but because she wanted to mark it. She folded the paper again, clean, square, slid it back into the pocket. Up ahead, the exit sign read, "Leaving Chillville." The irony was unnecessary. Lorraine had never really been part of Chillville. She had visited, and the town had responded by showing its spine, or its absence. The car merged onto the freeway. Trees blurred past. Lorraine rested her head lightly against the seat. Not tired, composed. She thought of no speeches. She remembered no slurs. She recited no victories. Some days are not for declaration, they are for exiting. At the edge of town, a billboard once filled with political ads now held a plain white canvas. No text, no slogan, just the faint outline of the shape where a poster had been torn away. Emptiness isn't always absence. Sometimes it's just space, waiting for someone else to speak. Lorraine looked once, then she closed her eyes, not because she was finished, because there was nothing more to watch, and no need to look back when the world had already turned its gaze forward. The driver said nothing, the road said nothing, and that was enough. It had been long enough that names had faded from headlines, long enough that the hashtags no longer trended, but not so long that the memory had dulled. Across the country, policy had shifted incrementally, training manuals revised, oversight panels convened and dispersed. But deep systems don't die from exposure. They adapt, they wait, they rebrand. And in room 3-4 of Harvard Law, on an early afternoon heavy with autumn light, the past did not appear as a headline. It returned as a question. The classroom was quiet, packed with minds sharpened by argument, anxious for clerkships and future influence. On the board, no case name was written, no syllabus cited. The professor stood at the front, not behind the lectern, but just in front of it, as though today he wasn't teaching the law, but something older, something foundational. He looked at the room and said, without greeting, "Today I'll ask only one question, and I won't ask it again." The students waited. He said, "A police officer smashes a car window because he is suspicious. There's no weapon, no threat, just a woman, older, silent, waiting. He drags her from the car. She bleeds. She does not resist. Later he learns she is not just someone. She is Lorraine Mitchell, mother of the Attorney General, former advisor to federal security oversight, a woman with clearance above his chief." He paused, not for drama, for breath. Where is the fault? No one moved. Law students are trained to parse, to analyze, to reframe. But this wasn't a question about legal process. It was about recognition, and it had no rubric. Silence stretched. Not a silence of confusion, but of confrontation. Then a hand rose, slowly, deliberately. She didn't speak with urgency. She spoke as someone who had lived inside the question long before it was asked. Her nameplate read, Amira James. The weeks following the incident had unfolded like a wound turning outward. At first, there was noise, screaming, headlines, the dry crackle of cable news voices reciting the same footage until even outrage became memorized. But the real shifts happened after the hashtags fell below the fold, after the public rage scattered and left behind only long shadows and permanent damage. Travis Colburn, the officer, didn't lose his badge immediately. Bureaucracy held on like scar tissue. But the consequences did not wait for paperwork. A food delivery app driver recognized him and refused to hand over his order, walking away without a word. The clip went viral, not for the confrontation, but for its absence. Just a plastic bag swinging from the handle of a locked patrol car, captured in silence and cold wind. It was the quiet that burned. Then came the phone calls, automated at first, then human, parents asking the school board why he was listed as a guest speaker for career day. Within 48 hours, his invitation was revoked. Not because of an official ruling, because a sixth grader had turned in a permission slip with the words, "Is he the one who broke the glass?" scrawled across the back. At a town hall forum meant to address civilian concerns, someone had printed his mugshot on 20 flyers and taped them, without comment, to every bathroom mirror in the building. Each bore a single handwritten line. "We saw who you are when you thought no one was watching." He didn't speak that evening. He sat in the back and blinked rapidly at the floor tiles, unable to leave, unwilling to look up. But perhaps the most lasting blow came not from strangers, but from within. A local cafe had sold him coffee for 9 years. Regular, no cream. His name is on the side of the cup. One morning, without ceremony, the barista handed him a sleeve that read, Mitchell Blend, in looping cursive. When he looked up, the girl behind the counter didn't blink, didn't smile. She simply moved on to the next customer. The moment passed like any transaction. But by nightfall, the sleeve was trending on social media, side by side with a still image of Lorraine's face, half obscured by safety glass and blood. The caption read, "Your regular will never be regular again." She spoke as someone who had lived inside the question long before it was asked. Her nameplate read Amira James. The fault, she said, was in the assumption that she couldn't be someone. The room stilled further. Even the tapping of keys stopped. She was already somebody, Amira continued, but the system taught that officer to read silence as defiance, age as threat, and blackness as probable cause. He didn't fail to verify her identity. He failed to believe she could have one that mattered. The professor didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't affirm. He simply asked, "And if she hadn't been who she was?" Amira didn't blink. "Then none of us would be here talking about it." A whisper passed across the room, not from voices, but from the slow contraction of breath, because that was the unbearable answer. If she had been less, she would have meant less. If she had been a nobody, she would have stayed that way. In police reports, in redacted files, in forgotten videos that no one shared. Because the victim didn't come with a biography, the professor turned to the board and wrote only 2 words, presumed insignificance. Then he capped the marker. He didn't explain it. He didn't ask for a debate. There was none to be had. For the next 30 minutes, no one raised their hand. Not because they were disengaged, but because the moment didn't require performance. A student near the window whispered, "What if she had fought back?" The room shifted. Another said, "Would that make it easier or harder to justify?" A third asked, "Why did it take a title to change the narrative?" Each question landed like a dropped stone in still water. The ripples touched every table, every tablet, every assumption. The professor said nothing. He paced once, slowly, then stood still again. Outside, the wind caught the edge of the ivy clinging to the old brick. The sunlight moved 2 inches down the window pane, but inside, the stillness remained. This wasn't about a lawsuit. This wasn't about whether the Fourth Amendment had been violated. This was about something unteachable. The moment when a room full of future defenders of the Constitution had to ask themselves if the Constitution had ever truly been written for everyone equally. And if not, then what the hell were they studying? Amira said nothing more. She had already said the truth, and truth, when precise, doesn't need repetition. When the clock struck, no one packed their bags. The professor said, "Class dismissed." But it didn't feel like the end of a class. It felt like the beginning of a consequence. In the hallway afterward, conversations didn't begin with laughter. They began with the quiet recognition that something had been named without being spelled out. Some would carry the question to their internships. Some would bury it beneath ambition. A few would change something real, but none would forget it. Because some lessons are not taught by the case law. They are taught by the silence that follows the right question, asked at the wrong time. And in that room, the wrong time had finally arrived.